Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society for this evening's public program. We are joining you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Interim Vice President for Programs at the Society. Our program this evening is titled Patriotism by Proxy, the Civil War Draft and the Cultural Formation of Citizen Soldiers, which is the title of a recent book by Colleen Glenney Boggs. I will introduce Colleen momentarily, but as there are many audience members who are joining us for the first time, I will give a brief introduction to the Society. The American Antiquarian Society is a national research library and a learned society devoted to exploring, understanding, and sharing America's and Americans' diverse stories pre-20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean, and we seek to collect and preserve for research one copy of everything that was printed in these areas before 1900. Our collections include books, pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, children's literature, broadsides, sheet music, and graphic arts materials such as prints, maps, photographs, political cartoons, and the ephemera of everyday life, such as Valentines and trade cards. I'm joined this evening by Kayla Hopper, Director of Outreach, and I'd like to ask her for just a few minutes to share the logistics of tonight's program.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm just going to quickly run through a few notes about how we're going to be using the Zoom webinar functions tonight. For the Q&A portion at the end of the program, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. We use the Q&A function so that we can keep track of questions. It also has an upvote function, so if someone has a question already posted that you want to see answered, feel free to upvote it and get it to the top of the queue, and that will help to ensure that it gets discussed. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program. The chat box is only going to be used for informational purposes. So throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and other information there, and you can contact us, the presenters, if there's any technical difficulty we should know about. If you want to save the chat at the end to save the links for future use, you can save a transcription of it by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. Finally, we are recording this program and we will make it available on our website and our YouTube channel for viewing later. That's it. Back to you, Nan.
Great. Thank you very much, Kayla. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Colleen Glenney Boggs, who is the Parents Distinguished Research Professor in the Humanities and Professor of English at Dartmouth College. A scholar of 19th century American literature, she has particular expertise in the literature of the American Civil War, animal studies, transatlantic studies, literary theory, and gender studies. She is recipient of fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, the Mellon Foundation, and from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a fellowship which she held at the American Antiquarian Society back in 2015-2016. And she was elected to membership at the Society in 2019. Colleen is the author of Patriotism by Proxy, the Civil War Draft and the Cultural Formation of Citizen Soldiers, 1863 to 1865, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. She's also the author of Animalia Americana, Animal Representations and Biopolitical Subjectivity, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2013, as well as Transnational and American Literature, Literary Translation, 1773 to 1892, published by Routledge in 2007. She edited Options for Teaching the Literatures of the American Civil War, published by the Modern Language Association in 2016. And she co-edits Edinburgh Critical Studies in Atlantic Literatures and Cultures. A member of the MLA Publications Committee, she has also served on the PMLA editorial board and as director of the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth. Colleen, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And thanks, Nan, thanks, Kayla, and thanks to the American Antiquarian Society for making this evening possible. Last but not least, I want to thank all the participants who are joining us on this webinar. I really appreciate your carving out time in your schedules to engage with my work. My book, Patriotism by Proxy, The Civil War Draft and the Cultural Formation of Citizen Soldiers, 1863 to 1865, was published by Oxford University Press in December 2020, as Nan just mentioned. I was actually trying to decide coming to this talk if I think the ink is still wet or if it's already dried on the book. It's strange to have work come out during a global pandemic. And so I am just really, really grateful for this opportunity to bring this work to you and to talk about the book with you. The American Antiquarian Society has been crucial for this work. I researched this book on a long-term fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I'm delighted to be able to share with you today some of the remarkable things that I found in the holdings of the AAS. I should note that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program or in the book itself do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I will be introducing the book by talking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. I will use PowerPoint to show you some images, but also to synthesize some of the information I will be introducing. There's a fair amount of information that I will be providing about the draft. Now, like many of you, I did not know the ins and outs of the draft when I started this project. So I'm sharing my own journey of inquiry with you. I'm not a military historian, as Nan mentioned, I'm a literary scholar, and I actually didn't come at this project as a Civil War buff. What drew me to this project initially was the fact that literary scholars, unlike historians, write fairly little about the American Civil War. And I was curious about that gap itself, but also about some of the assumptions that it leads to, such as the assumption that by and large, American literature seems to be a civilian affair. In a country of such military might, that seems odd. And it seems particularly odd for a period when the military itself vastly changed, and when it in turn vastly changed American life and letters. The draft itself fascinates me because there had not been a federal draft previously in American history, and the draft crystallizes many of the larger questions about the relationship of citizens to the state and citizens to one another. That second part, the relationship of people to one another, is particularly crucial because of the Civil War draft's special provisions, most notably the substitute clause, as I will explain in a moment. But before I get ahead of myself, let me offer these final words of introduction. My talk today falls into two general parts. One, a historical overview of the Civil War draft, and the second, a case study of the rich discussions and texts to which it gave rise. It seems a bit strange to me to propose these as separate parts, because the core interest that guides my work is the relationship between historical developments and literary texts. I am curious how literature reflects, rejects, and redirects historical occurrences. So let's get started. In July 1863, a new front opened up in the American Civil War. This one pitted angry mobs made up largely of Irish immigrant laborers against government authorities in New York City. The riots were triggered by the first United States military draft, which had just been enacted by the federal government. The Confederacy had imposed a draft in 1862. Union troops had been raised on a voluntary basis at the local and state level at the outbreak of the war. A militia draft in 1862 had laid the groundwork for the involuntary levying of troops. The first ever national draft made armed service a federal mandate for white men. The draft offered a range of actions to those who were called up. They could serve, they could claim an exemption on grounds of physical impairment or familial obligation. They could pay a commutation fee to avoid that particular draft, or they could hire a substitute and thereby avoid being drafted for a 3-year period. While service and medical exemption were options for all, only wealthy draftees could afford to purchase an exemption by hiring a substitute or by paying the commutation fee of $300, which amounted roughly to a laborer's annual wages. The perception arose that the draft unfairly disadvantaged white immigrant workers. In fact, those workers were not more likely to get drafted, but they were unable to afford the commutation fee or be able to pay for a substitute, and they were more likely themselves to serve as substitutes for wealthy draftees. Those laborers also felt their livelihood and their racial identity threatened by the Emancipation Proclamation enacted that same year and by the recruitment of African American troops. Emancipation and the draft were linked in the popular perception, as the following cartoon illustrates. The image depicts Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln. Stanton holds a cudgel labeled draft and, referring to two generals, exclaims, "Halleck may use his skill and Mac his strategy, but this draft will do the business." Holding an axe labeled Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln responds, "You can try him with that, but I'm afraid this axe of mine is the only thing that will fetch him." Now, I apologize to any Lincoln impersonators out there for my insufficient impersonation of Lincoln. Lincoln's use of emancipation as a war measure concerned many white immigrant laborers, and the conjuncture of these two measures, the draft and emancipation, proved combustible when riots erupted in New York. Angered by the prospect that newly liberated slaves would assert racial equality and compete for their jobs while they themselves were fighting the slaveholding South, the rioters targeted the properties of those associated with abolition and targeted the bodies of African Americans. Racist attacks resulted in the burning of the so-called Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue and in numerous lynchings. Order was eventually restored when troops returning from Gettysburg marched into New York. Even though the draft had peacefully resumed by August 1863, the larger challenge of the riots remained to be worked out. As Susanna Ural-Bruce notes, intense debates over conscription raged almost as loudly as the bloody battles of the spring and summer of 1863. Ivor Bernstein argues that national and local issues became joined as Americans waited anxiously to see whether, or on what terms, and under whose auspices, the powerful metropolis, with its democratic majorities and vast immigrant poor, would participate in the war and the Republican project of nation-making. This project of nation-making depended on converting the rioting mob into a compliant citizenry in its relation to military service. The contested meanings of the draft were worked out in pages of newspapers, diaries, cartoons, songs, and poems, in which well-known authors, such as Emily Dickinson or Herman Melville, but also ordinary people, voiced their thoughts and made sense of these new developments. Widely reported in the press, the riots had ripple effects throughout the Union. Unrests erupted elsewhere, but engagement with the draft also took forms other than spectacular violence, as Americans began to assess the symbolic significance and physical reach of the new governmental measure. Also known as conscription, which etymologically means the action of writing or composing in writing, the draft was a massive bureaucratic undertaking that connected the nation's abstract symbolism with the government's concrete reach into Americans' lives. Equitable as the draft was in theory, in practice, it laid bare divisions of class, race, ethnicity, and gender. It also brought to the forefront deep conceptual questions about the extent to which the state could lay claim to the lives of its citizens. At a time when the nation depended on bodies for its existence, Americans grappled with their own position in new systems that categorized individuals based on physical and social criteria. Complexly layered, their deliberations about the collective meanings and personal responses to the draft speak to the cultural significance of the draft that extended beyond the public horrors of riots into the intimacies of communal and familial relations. As the military draft turned the levying of troops into an increasingly far-reaching and fine-tuned bureaucracy, conscription reoriented the relationship of Americans to the state and to one another. Substitutes, or we could say proxies, became a focal point for the ways in which Americans theorized and experienced the draft. The Civil War draft was the only one of the 5 national drafts that have occurred to date in American history that permitted draftees to avoid service by hiring a substitute. The Confederacy prohibited the practice in December 1863, but the Union Army, on which my book focuses, permitted substitutions through the end of the war. A unique feature of the Civil War draft, substitutes accounted for 3/4 of the men entering the military as a result of the draft. And so it is perhaps fair to say that the draft did not yield draftees as much as it generated substitutes. When we talk about the impact of the Civil War on American culture, we tend to focus on the number of soldiers who died, recently recalculated from roughly 620,000 to approximately 750,000. Excellent work has been done by Franny Noodleman, Drew Gilpin-Faust, and Megan Kate Nelson on the cultural impact of those casualties. But with our focus trained on mass casualties, we risk overlooking the thousands upon thousands of additional soldiers who served but did not die during the war. In 1860, the Union had roughly 28,000 military personnel on active duty. By 1865, those figures on the Union side had swelled to over 1 million active service members. For 1865, the estimated total number of veterans who had served at some point during the conflict was 1.8 million. For the Confederate side, calculations of active service during the war ranged from 600,000 to 1.5 million. Approximately 2.5 million enlistments by white men can be documented. That number becomes even more resonant if we translate it into percentages and realize that for white men of eligible age, it is probably fair to say that roughly 40% served on the Union side, and that the percentage on the Confederate side was roughly twice that rate. The scale of wartime military bureaucracy is tremendous and was, to that date, unprecedented. Among those vast figures, draftees and substitutes made up for what might seem like a relatively small subset of the millions who served. During the federal draft years of 1863 through 1865, only a little over 13% of the men brought into the service consisted of conscripts and substitutes on the Union side, whereas about 21% of the men serving in the Confederate armies were conscripts or substitutes. These numbers are not quantitatively negligible, but they lead Timothy Perry to wonder if a system in which draftees represented such a small percentage of those who served had a different purpose than did 20th, I almost said 21st, but then the 20th century drafts, which focused on drastically increased troop numbers. The Civil War draft was, in fact, used to incentivize volunteering. And so, paradoxically, by 1863, the relationship between coercive and voluntary service had become somewhat fluid. So long as volunteers filled the ranks, the draft was not needed, and the ability to earn bounty money by volunteering made that option more attractive than the possibility of getting drafted and not receiving a bounty payment. The effect of the draft was the creation of a new relation between the state and its citizens, and amongst citizens to one another. As Alice Foss points out, Civil War literature emphasized that those who fought in the war were not professional soldiers, but citizen soldiers, with the emphasis on citizen. The term citizen soldier was in use during the Civil War and became a synonym for national soldiers. While volunteering offered one version of these concepts, the military draft was not merely reflective of already existing notions of citizenship, but productive of changing its parameters for inclusion. The military draft transformed the content of citizenship for white Americans, as well as for immigrants and African Americans. Immigrants occupied a position between alienage and citizenship. The Union actively incentivized immigration in order to raise troops and passed legislation in July of 1862 that provided citizenship to immigrants who resided in the United States for 1 year and served in the Army. For immigrants who were already in the country, the draft posed an unexpected set of challenges. Immigrants underwent a two-stage naturalization process, first by declaring an intention to become citizens, and then by being naturalized. Where in that process they became eligible for the draft was a topic of contention. As Harper's Weekly made clear, the proclamation for the enforcement of the Conscription Act stipulated that persons of foreign birth who have declared their intentions to become citizens are, by this proclamation, pronounced liable to be drafted. In response to such provisions, the British government inquired how the US draft would apply to British subjects. Initially, Secretary of State William Seward offered assurances that this department has never regarded an alien who may have merely declared his intention to become a citizen as entitled to a passport, and consequently has always withheld from persons of that character any such certificates of citizenship. However, the Enrollment Act of March 1863 stipulated that persons of foreign birth who shall have declared on oath their intention of becoming citizens and were 20 to 45-year-old males were eligible for the draft. The draft fast-tracked immigration, so to speak, though that expedited route went through the Army. The draft presented a different challenge for African Americans who actively sought inclusion in the military in general and the military draft in particular to gain access to citizenship and to be counted among the population, rather than to be separated out as slaves who were counted as 3/5 of a person. The 1857 Dred Scott decision had given no affirmative meaning to citizenship, but had defined the idea negatively so as to exclude African Americans. African Americans leveraged both enlistment and the draft to become citizens de facto when they were not yet citizens de jure. The racial configuration of the Union Army changed dramatically with the formation of African American regiments in 1863, with African American soldiers' service as substitutes, and with the extension of the draft to African Americans in 1864. The path towards the first authoritative definition of citizenship in American law, namely the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment passed in 1868, went through the military draft. As Frederick Douglass, who spent the war years recruiting for the Union, put it, quote, "The true course to the Black man's freedom and citizenship was over the battlefield, and my business was to get every Black man I could into the Union armies." Particularly appealing to African American men was the association of military service with the masculinity that slavery had categorically denied them. Military service was crucial for constructions of masculinity, as scholars such as Lorene Foote have shown, but it also impacted gender more broadly speaking. The military draft also redefined women's roles and gave them new forms of access to the state. Assessing the gendered aspects of the draft in her work on Southern Confederate women, Stephanie McCurry writes, "As the grounds of a collective political identity, the soldier's wife was as much a product of the draft as her soldier husband." Tracing the development of a whole set of new war-born political identities, individual and collective, McCurry sees soldier's wife as a particularly important example of the newly intimate and fraught relationship between government authorities, citizens, and subjects. Women expressed that role in writing in attempts to change their political agency through their own actions. By 1864, the number of petitions to war governors authored by women or by men and women together overmatched those authored simply by men. In these documents, soldiers' wives turned the sacrifice of their men into a legitimate claim on the state's protection and resources. The state military bureaucracy morphed into the pension and veterans medical system and far outlasted the war years themselves. As you may imagine, attitudes towards the draft were split and also changed over the course of the war's duration. When I was at the American Antiquarian Society, I carefully traced such changing attitudes via a case study of the Springfield Republican. I chose that paper because it offers a good example of a Northern newspaper reliably supportive of the Lincoln administration. The paper's editor, Samuel Bowles, also had particular ties to Emily Dickinson's work and her family, which I discuss in one of the chapters. The Springfield Republican was typical of newspapers at the time for printing political news and literary pieces side by side. As Eliza Tamarkin writes, literature in the 19th century was often indistinguishable from the news, appearing on the pages of newspapers alongside reports of recent events and assuming many of the stylistic features that structured the daily experience of print culture. We will be looking at some of the literature published in the Springfield Republican a bit later. For now, I want to discuss the attitudes expressed in the newspaper towards the draft, which underwent 3 distinct phases. First, an impassioned critique of the Confederate draft enacted in 1862. An image that I found in the archives of the American Antiquarian Society illustrates the attitude that the Confederate draft was a form of brutal coercion. The image shows men being violently pressed into service, despite one of them insisting, "I am a Union man and don't believe in your Southern Confederacy." The image captures the claim that even among Southern troops, many did not wish to secede, let alone fight against the Union. The image erodes the Southern cause from within by insisting that the Confederacy can only operate by coercion, and it captures a moment in the war when the Union sees conscription as a Southern practice that reveals the moral as well as political illegitimacy of the insurrection. The second phase in attitudes involved a critical debate over the meaning of a potential draft for the Union. Given the staunch criticism of the Confederate draft that we just saw, the Springfield Republican had to figure out how to reconcile its attitudes with the actions of the Lincoln administration. This led to the third and final phase, the depiction of the draft as consistent with Union values. These shifting attitudes also track with shifting federal policy, and especially that final phase is one we should take with a grain of salt, given changing government regulations that made it treasonous to criticize the draft. In one widely publicized case, Congressman Clement Vallandigham was put on military trial and exiled to the Confederacy for his outspoken opposition against the draft. The case was so controversial that Lincoln himself issued a pamphlet defending the proceedings against the congressman. Within this difficult legal and political landscape, literary texts became a way to work out the draft's meanings. One tactic that the Springfield Republican used to make the draft palatable was to insist that the conscript and the volunteer were versions of one another. The Springfield Republican reprinted from the Boston Transcript a poem entitled "The Conscript Song" that connected the two. Spoken in the first person of a draftee, the poem assured readers that, quote, "this conscript's heart is a volunteer." For that matter, there were efforts throughout the war to maintain the notion that the Army was composed of volunteers, even though the draft was in full swing. Substitutes signed a pre-printed contract for, quote, "substitute volunteer enlistment." One person who availed himself of this option was the son of wealthy Worcester merchant and American Antiquarian Society benefactor Stephen Salisbury II. When his son, Stephen Salisbury III, was drafted, the family exchanged an extensive correspondence archived at AAS in which they deliberated over the family's obligations to the Union and their response to the draft. Salisbury did not see his son's draft simply as something to be avoided, though that avoidance was a foregone conclusion. But he saw it as an occasion to redefine his and his family's relationship to the Union. He noted that, quote, "the easiest thing is to pay the $300, but I apprehend that it might be more useful to procure a substitute. The government wants men more than money, and it especially wants good examples." Salisbury was looking for a solution that was not only expeditious, but also principled. Setting aside the ease, or rather his ease, of paying the commutation fee in order to find a more useful solution, he wanted to see good examples. Who or what exactly these good examples were remains a bit obscure in this particular context. The good examples seem to be Salisbury and his son, who take the more complicated route of securing a substitute over the easier one of paying the commutation fee. Given Salisbury's emphasis on the government's need for men, it also appears that the substitute himself was meant to be exemplary. While we may see Salisbury's desire to keep his son out of the war as contorting both personal integrity and national service, he argued to the contrary in addressing Stephen, and here again I'm quoting Salisbury, "Looking only to personal interest, you have no higher interest than to support the government and the institutions of the country, and happily, here, as in most cases, the purest lessons of duty concur with the dictates of interest. While it was in Stephen's, or at least in his father's interest, to keep him out of the war, Salisbury also insisted that his decision was compatible with the highest interest of supporting the government and the institutions of the country. For Salisbury, the decision to hire a substitute for his son did not run counter to his sense of patriotism. On the contrary, hiring a substitute manifested Salisbury's dedication to the national cause. The fulfillment of those patriotic goals hinged on the careful selection of an appropriate substitute, a task with which Salisbury charged his son. He emphasized that it was important to hire a good substitute, ideally someone who had already served an initial term in the war, and that sending in someone who went voluntarily and had advanced military skills was far more beneficial to the Union cause than sending Stephen, who, moreover, could be of more service to the Union by remaining in his civilian capacity. The younger Salisbury eventually found a substitute he deemed suitable, and Michael Halligan served in his stead, while Stephen was elected that same year as a member of the American Antiquarian Society, for which his father had been president since 1854. The archival record that we have from the Salisburys is extensive and fascinating. But what do we know about the man who served in Stephen's stead, Michael Halligan, and his deliberation vis-a-vis the draft? Very little. Michael Halligan enabled the archive from which he was largely erased. Official documents suggest that Michael Halligan did not meet the Salisbury family's wishes for being exemplary and what they considered an apt representation for Stephen. An Irish laborer, Halligan seems to have had more in common with the New York City rioters than with the Salisbury family, whose scion he was hired to represent in the war. Born between 1836 and 1837 in Ireland, he was listed in the 1850 U.S. federal census on 25 August 1850 at Clinton, Worcester County, Massachusetts, as the occupant of a boarding house hotel. When he mustered into service on July 17, 1862, with the 15th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, he gave his occupation as laborer. Wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania County, Virginia, on December 13, 1862, he apparently deserted on February 6, 1863, while on furlough from the General Hospital in Washington, D.C. Starting July 30, 1863, he began serving in the 19th Massachusetts Infantry while in desertion from the 15th. He was arrested for that desertion on April 15, 1864. Wounded again in May 1864, he seems to have died sometime thereafter, though his widow, who appears in the 1870 census as age 37 and illiterate, had difficulty receiving his pension because she could not prove his death. We can only speculate whether this lack of evidence was strategic on Halligan's part. During the war, conscript deserters were brought in every day and used every device possible to escape identification. Whether strategic or not, the traces of Michael Halligan seem to end there. As Tyler Anbinder laments, there is no other group of soldiers of whom we know as little as Civil War substitutes. Even though the documentary record trails off, the cultural archive of poems, songs, stories, images, and ephemera opens up other ways of encountering the substitute in a variety of genres across tonal shifts, from the serious to the parodic, as a person, a character, and a metaphor. Even though I've offered a lot of historical context today, that cultural archive is really at the core of my project because it gives us such a range of voices and insights and offers compelling interpretations of a significant historical moment that raised fundamental questions about the relationship between the state and its citizens. I think that there are three distinct things we can say about the importance of the cultural archive for understanding the draft. And actually, I should say four distinct things because I think I added one last minute. So here's the list. One, we hear in literary texts echoes of people who are marginal to the written record preserved in archives. Literary devices, such as metaphor and parody, themselves involve substitutions and offer creative, innovative, playful, as well as critical ways of thinking about the relationship between so-called principals, those drafted, and their substitutes. literature offered a creative means of discussing the draft when voicing criticism was risky under the suspension of habeas corpus. By creative, I also mean that literature is able to offer interpretations that might go against commonly shared understandings or open up venues for future possibilities. For instance, in insisting that military service offered a path to citizenship for African Americans when that was not realized till 1868. What I want to do in the time remaining is look with you at one of the examples that I discuss in the book. The example that I chose for today is one that picks up from a literary perspective the various themes and challenges that I have outlined. The example is actually a cluster of poems, starting with a poem that was meant to incentivize enlistments and that called for several parodies and also became a touchstone for the changing meanings of military service. This one poem and the responses to it then offer a way of examining the different perspectives on the draft and the creative means of interpreting the draft's significance. The 1862 poem, "We Are Coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more," responded to Lincoln's call for more troops and was meant to boost voluntary enlistments at the time when the Militia Draft was going into effect. The poem imagines soldiers willingly abandoning their nuclear families and homesteads to serve the wartime cause. "We're coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more, from Mississippi's winding stream and from New England's shore. We leave our plows and workshops, our wives and children dear, with hearts too full of utterance, with but a silent tear. We dare not look behind us, but steadfastly before. We are coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more." The collective speakers, we, promise to leave our plows and workshops, our wives and children dear. That is to say, they promise to leave their own families for the good of the national family, represented by Father Abraham. Using the collective we, the poem uses the poetic voice to articulate a collective sense of national belonging and commitment to armed service. Widely reprinted and set to music, the poem envisioned a voluntary surge in troops. It elicited a different kind of surge. The lyrics had been penned by abolitionist James Sloan Gibbons, whose house was one of the first to be attacked in the draft riots of 1863, with which I began my talk. Still, the song remained popular even after those events and became a Lincoln campaign song in 1864. But the song's meanings were contested, and we may wonder if Michael Halligan marched off singing the following verses to mock the Salisburys. "We're coming, Father Abraham, $300 more. We're rich enough to stay at home. Let them go out that's poor. But Uncle Abe, we're not afraid to stay behind in clover. We'll nobly fight, defend the right when this cruel war is over." Accusing the so-called principals, that is, the people who hired substitutes, of practicing patriotism by proxy, the parody contrasts the original poem's call to volunteer with the reality of the draft. The 300,000 more of the original have become $300 more. That is, they have been replaced by the commutation fee or by a substitute hired for that price. Using the voice of the principals, the parody takes aim at the very structure of wartime representation. On paper, the parody is in the same voice as Gibbon's poem. The speaker is a man who's called into service. In the original poem, that man musters into the army. In the parody, he does not. In the parody, as in the original, he claims to fulfill the patriotism to which he is called. In the Gibbons poem, he does so by his own service. In the parody, he does so by the service of another. The parody calls into question how and whether the two can be disaggregated in this way. That is, whether it is possible to separate the citizen from the soldier. By showing the principal to rely on his wealth, the poem makes staying at home a monetary privilege. It refers to the luxury of living in clover. Moreover, the song appropriates the justifications offered by the principals for staying at home, insisting that they're not afraid, and then immediately qualifying that claim to suggest that they fearlessly enjoy their own privilege. The poem suggests that the patriotism to which they lay claim is merely meant to bolster their own sense of self. The collective we in the poem shifts in the parody. This we is no longer an echo, as it had been in the original poem, of the Constitution's we the people. That phrase unites the people in a national collective. But in this parody, we has become a small group of privileged people who claim their patriotism, yet send others to fight in the war. In the parody, we does not represent the national collective nor the national good, and instead stands for a specific group of wealthy people who lay claim to a we that has become selective and divisive along economic lines that separate the rich from the poor who fight the war. Offering that they will nobly fight when the cruel war is over, the song makes clear that the substitutes who march off in their stead are the ones who have courage and valor. What they do not have is money and the ability to defend the right from home, with a reference to right suggesting that the war's legal setup itself is rigged to defend those who are already privileged. By taking on the voice of the principles, the song explodes the very notion so cautiously and carefully cultivated in the Salisbury family letters that there is anything exemplary about the actions of the principals. Calling into question the logic by which the substitutes represent the principals in the war, the song demonstrates how the claims made by the principals collapse because of their own lack of valor and their cynical justifications of their own privilege. A very different take on conscription and on the way it does or does not enable an inclusive national we emerges in Grace Fleetwood's The Conscript's Prayer, which was published in the Springfield Republican, July 25th, 1863. I'm going to be focusing on the verse on the slide, but want to give you a few other verses for the full flavor of this poem. Oh, hear us, Father Abraham, as at the call we come. We leave our wives and little ones. We leave our hearth at home. We leave our blooming valleys. We leave our granite hills. We rush to freedom's rescue with firm, determined wills. Then hear us, Father Abraham, one earnest prayer we make, both for our future happiness and for our country's sake. Oh, send us not to garrison the islands of the sea, far from the reach of danger and human sympathy. Oh, send us not to prison in any dismal fort, for no high-minded citizen would such confinement court. Oh, send us not to labor beneath the southern sun. We're coming, Father Abraham, that victories may be won. We're coming, Father Abraham, to meet our country's foe and deal on southern chivalry a last and fatal blow. Then grant us our petition and hurry us along. We're coming for our liberties with willing hearts and strong. While the opening verse sounds like a direct rewriting of the original's lines, the poem takes a dramatic turn in the second line, where the speakers actively ask not to be kept out of danger. The third stanza has a similar request, listing a number of positions away from battle that the speakers reject, positions that were assigned to newly liberated slaves who were earlier in the conflict deemed contraband of war, but increasingly were called upon to bear arms. The poem was printed with the notation Pittsfield, July 1863, which links it to the recruitment of African American troops. Following the success of filling the Massachusetts 54th, the number of recruits was sufficient to warrant forming a sister regiment, and recruiting stations were established and meetings held at Pittsfield and other places. Printed after both the New York City draft riots and the massacre of African American troops at Fort Wagner, the song does not overtly state the race of its speakers. Yet the supplications it includes make sense only when we read it as coming from African Americans. Adopting a call and response structure, the poem opens, "Oh, hear us, Father Abraham, as at the call we come." This line is strange in the sense that the call is doubled. It is the call of the speakers joining the armed services, as well as the call of Lincoln for more troops. At this juncture, the only group calling to come into the army were African Americans. And so the poem opens the possibility that the we being voiced here is an African American first person plural. The poem substantiates this reading in the final lines that are on the slide. The final 4 lines appear to be the collective voice of the African American community that was petitioning for its liberties. The call of Father Abraham for more troops is transformed in the poem. Not only are those troops coming, they are thereby coming for their liberties to enter the service as the poem states, high-minded citizens. Let me then step back from this specific poem and suggest that we see among the different pieces I've shared a dialogue between texts that offers us a different way of seeing the debates over conscription and what it meant to be a citizen soldier. There are many things that we can learn from this moment in history by studying the cultural archive. For today, I hope that I've accomplished the following: to outline how multi-layered the draft itself and the responses to the draft were, how figuring out the relation to the draft was also a way of understanding the parameters of citizenship, and how cultural texts offer us insights as to the rich ways in which people made meaning of the war in general and the draft in particular. We might assume that the story of the draft ends with the draft, or at least goes dormant till there's another draft and another war. We might think that the issue of substitutes never comes up again, since the next draft of 1917 explicitly prohibited the practice. But there are issues that get raised in the Civil War draft that extend beyond the war years. The draft in general, and substitution in particular, raise the fundamental question what it means for one person to stand in for another in service to the state. I think that this is a tremendously moving question when we encounter the real lives of people such as Stephen Salisbury III and Michael Halligan. It is also a fascinating abstract and theoretical question, one that engages the fundamentals of representative democracy and is worked out on the textual level in the use of voice and the multiple meanings that we can have for referencing a single national people or for many different groups of people within a nation. Those questions have historic specificity in these literary materials, but they also transcend their time and demand our attention. Thank you so much for listening, and I believe we are ready to open up now for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for that fabulous talk. And thank you for helping us to learn more about our own institutional history through this. I love the way.
Can I just insert one thing there, Nan? I will insert that actually, I actually found those letters through the help of staff in the reading room who knew what I was working on, said, we have these great letters, so why don't you look at those? Yes. So that was one of the many nods there, taking off my hat there to the wonderful staff that helped me locate all these materials.
We always love to hear that. This has been really quite wonderful, and it's great to see the way you're using images as well as text to get at this question of conscription and substitutes. I'm going to, given the time and the number of questions, I'm going to save my own questions and jump right to some of those that are coming in from the audience so that we can get to as many as possible. And I know you have said that you are not a military historian, so, but there is a question here that a couple of people were wondering about whether people who began farms were exempt from the draft, and if so, was there a minimum farm size required?
People who began farms, so people who are newly homesteading is what I'm hearing in that question. I am not sure about the specifics of the farming itself or the size of a farm. But what I mentioned in terms of the exemptions earlier on, I mentioned the exemptions for physical impairment or for certain familial and social obligations. And so if someone was the sole breadwinner for a large family. That would be the kind of thing that was tabulated there. And I would certainly assume that farming and homesteading might be a portion of that, but I'm not sure. The question though of different ways in which territory is also being reconfigured has a particular resonance for me, because one of the exemptions that actually was not possible, that I think we would actually assume would have been possible, would have been an exemption for being in college. That becomes, I think, one of the big issues in the Vietnam draft, right? And there was not that exemption during the Civil War draft. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that there is not that exemption, even though the Morrill Act goes into effect in 1862. So actually, a lot of the land grant universities come out of that moment in the Civil War and actually start teaching military sciences as part of their curriculum. So there's also a militarization of higher education as some of that land distribution occurs, even at a time when students are not being exempt. So that's a little bit of a far cry from the initial question, but hopefully a way of at least offering some context for also maybe places to look for the precise question about farming and the size of farms.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have a question here from Jared Rosenthal, and it corresponds with one that Richard Brown was asking as well about distinguished families, and such as Oliver Wendell Holmes, that they had some sons who volunteered. Did any other families make public comments about people like the Salisburys who paid for substitutes?
Yes. Oh, that's such a wonderful question. And I so appreciate that this question is actually coming at this through an example of someone who served. Because very often, actually, I think the question, and for good reasons, start off with those who didn't serve because they were privileged and didn't want to serve. For a long time, I think one of the assumptions about the Civil War draft and also about American literature was that actually those who went on to write American literature after the American Civil War were those who hadn't served. In part because they survived, but also that they then had a very different relationship to that time period. One of the few books dating back to the 1960s about Civil War literature is actually titled The Unwritten War, that is Edmund Wilson's book. And so I love the fact that this question is actually starting with those who did serve. Yes, there were other families, and I think one that's particularly interesting and that I draw on in the conclusion to the book is the James family, because with the James family, you have a tremendous split between the two older brothers and the two younger brothers. And then, of course, there's also the sister who figures into all James family things in fascinating ways, Alice James. But Henry James was actually exempt based on a physical impairment. That's that obscure hurt that he talks about, which he incurred when he helped extinguish a fire I'm blanking on the name right, Newport, there it is, Rhode Island, and therefore was not eligible to serve. He actually goes on to Harvard Law School, and in some of his writing imagines going there as if he were going on to camp. It's a very, very strange moment. And I think that one of the things that he is processing there is his own exemption from the war at a time when his younger brothers not only served, but were wounded in battle and served with the Massachusetts 54th and 55th. So we really were actually also part of a different kind of, I guess I could almost say, a quote unquote, an elite that served with Robert Gould Shaw and with the high visibility of, and here we also really need to think about the racial politics of an elite white officer structure for the African American troops. And the James family really is, I think, one where those lines run directly through that family. So I hope that offers one of the many places to go with that wonderful, generous and generative question.
Excellent, thank you. Here's a question that came in fairly early on. Do you think that the Civil War draft served as models of mobilization that would be used for business and industry?
I really, really appreciate that question. I think it's a wonderful question. It goes far beyond what I'm about to say, but one of the reasons why I so appreciate that question was that there's a portion of the book that I just wasn't able to incorporate into this talk. And that has to do with this number that keeps coming up. You've seen it in the literature that I shared today, the $300, the 300,000, which become the $300. In one of the variations on these kinds of draft poems, the question is asked, how are you greenbacks, right? And it's actually thinking about those who are serving as substitute as themselves having been turned into money in a certain way. And one of the reasons for that is not just the ability to pay the commutation fee, not just that kind of one commercial exchange, but actually the fact that a real, I guess we could call it an industry very quickly arose over substitutes and substitute hiring, so that there were substitute brokers. In the book, I actually have an image of substitute brokers in New York City who would connect someone who needed a substitute with someone who was willing to serve as a substitute. And generally speaking, they were very, very, very much looked down upon, because the sense was that they were not dealing honestly with anyone on either end of that transaction, and that they were making tons of money for themselves, skimming off tons of money from that transaction, from that process. There was also the suspicion that those who served as volunteers served as substitutes would sign up in one place and then desert and sign up in another place and just keep cashing in and just turn this into kind of a money-making mechanism. And so the whole way in which there is this draft economy that arises is actually really central. One of the things that makes this, I think, even more fascinating is that the very word that I mentioned, greenbacks, actually also refers to the currency that was introduced at the time. And one of the many rabbit holes that I found myself going down, looking at this project, looking at this material that I just had not expected when I started this, was actually looking at what greenbacks looked like in 1863 to understand better some of the imagery in some of these draft poems and the way in which this idea that lives are being monetized and that there's an industry growing up around the commodification of draft substitutes is being worked through. So I think the question goes far beyond that. I think there are other ways in which we can think about war and industry, but for my specific purposes, I was really interested in this industry of the substitute brokers and the way in which the substitutes themselves were, at least by some accounts, turned into greenbacks, turned into money.
Yeah, I actually remember that rabbit hole you went down when you were here.
Yes.
It was a lot of fun. This is a question from Springfield, which is the home of the Republican, the newspaper you referenced. Paul asks, he says he's intrigued by the idea of literature allowing newspapers to work through contradictions in their political stances and rhetoric. Presuming that literary authors were unaware of news pieces against which their work would run, should the study of Civil War literature focus more on newspaper editors?
That is a wonderful question. And I feel like it's the kind of question where that could actually be a whole panel at a conference in and of itself. I do think that the question about editors is an excellent question. There are high-profile editors at this time. A little bit later, we can certainly think of William Dean Howells, whom we can actually also really think about as someone who writes about substitutes later on and becomes an influential editor after the Civil War. But I think the question directly also addresses Samuel Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican, who in ever so many ways, really, at times I think actually single-handedly wrote that paper, printed it, held it together, and was so instrumental in giving shape to the content. So I think that in the case of someone like Bowles, thinking about the kind of work that he as an editor did is really interesting, really fascinating. One thing that makes that more complicated, though, is the practice of papers also drawing from elsewhere. I was referencing the poem that got printed there, which actually got taken from another paper. And there's always, I think, some what I think Meredith McGill and others have helped us understand as a kind of culture of reprinting, a kind of print circulation, which is different from what we see now with a different set of copyright laws that we have these days. So the question of on the one hand, wanting to really think about the power, the voice of an editor, but then also even within a powerful editor's paper, some of the limitations of that is, I think, crucial. And then I think the second or maybe even third part of that question also involved authors not knowing what they would be kind of up against, the context in which they would be printed. And I think that is a question that, again, we could really think about, certainly in terms of the hesitation of someone like Emily Dickinson to appear in print, even though she did appear in print and appeared in print in the Springfield Republican, among one of the few places she appeared in print during her lifetime. But then also the way in which, sometimes we can identify a direct author who may have had opinions about appearing alongside, something or not. But papers also facilitating something beyond that, something that I think I was gesturing at by putting these poems together. There's a kind of conversation and a dialogue that pieces enter into. There's a book by Michael Cohen that talks about the so-called social lives of poems in this time period. And I think newspapers are one of the areas where we can see a kind of social life where these poems are talking to one another. They're being made to talk to pieces that they're printed alongside. Then, of course, there are people responding, their letters to the editor, or actually your response poems to the poem that someone has read. So there is also that separate dialogue, and a dialogue that I think very often exceeds some of our notions of the way in which authorship works and the way in which print culture works, because I think we're coming from a different context from the way in which 19th century print worked.
Great, thank you. So we're running out of time, but I think we can do at least one more question. Robert Levine is asking, well, first saying it's a fascinating talk, as he's wondering if Edward Hale's very popular and complex A Man Without a Country speaks obliquely to issues connected with the draft, given that Vallandigham's seems to have inspired the story.
Yes, that is a wonderful and generous question. And that whole little tidbit that I inserted there, I really appreciate how the question is picking up on that, right? The fact that Vallandigham was put on trial, military trial for his objection to the draft. And it was actually Lincoln who commuted his sentence to be exiled to the Confederacy. So there was a intervention there. And so this whole idea of what that exile means and whether that is actually an echo or an inspiration for the way in which Hale thinks about Man Without a Country, and even what that then means for our notions, and actually for some of the key terms I was using, of citizenship, of patriotism. I really like the way in which the question itself, I think, shows some of the ways in which these terms, which I think we tend to think of as having a kind of meaning, even a kind of solidity, are so much in flux at that time. So I think I think the short answer to the question is yes.
Yes, and I think what people should certainly get your book and read, because I think some of these remaining questions would be answered, including this one, which is, and I'll just end with this, because how can we not end with Emily Dickinson, the regular reader of the Springfield Republican? Do any of her Civil War poems reflect this?
Yes. Thank you so much for asking that question. And there's actually a whole section in the book on Emily Dickinson. I actually am trying out in the book something that I hope other scholars will agree with me on and will take up. I actually have a reference to a so-called broker poems, because I was just talking now about the brokers who facilitated the quote-unquote sale of substitutes, facilitated that economic relationship. And Emily Dickinson was keenly interested in that. She was deeply interested in the economics of the war, as well as the question of what happens to notions of personhood under these wartime conditions, under the draft conditions. And I think one of the things, and I'm going to end with a teaser here, one of the things that makes this personal as well as complexly abstract for Dickinson is the fact that her own family, her father and her brother, were actively involved in recruiting for the army, but her brother Well, I'm going to end on a teaser. Her brother was called up, and you'll just have to read that chapter to find out what happened with Emily Dickinson's brother when he was called up. But let's just say that his sister, I think, reflected extensively on all the above and really drew from her readings of the Springfield Republican and turned some of what she read there into, I think, some of her most complex Civil War poems.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Well, Colleen, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion, and we really appreciate your taking the time to share your work with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. And I encourage you to join us a week from tonight for another public program, a conversation with Andrew Stauffer, and you can find out more about that on our website. And I believe Kayla has put that information into the chat so you can get to all the information about registering for additional public programs. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Colleen, and have a good evening.
Thank you, and take care.